There are a lot of people with very extreme views in the Donald Trump administration in the United States. Overseeing U.S. foreign policy is Marco Rubio, a notorious neoconservative war hawk who has strongly supported many U.S. wars, and during Trump's first term, he even proposed that the U.S. military should consider invading Venezuela. Then there's the U.S. National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, who's another neocon who has called for a very aggressive policy against China and Iran, basically pushing for war on Iran. However, among all of the members of Trump's cabinet, I think the figure who has the most extreme views of all is the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth. In 2020, Hegseth published a book called American Crusade, in which he proudly declared that he is a crusader, and he argued that the United States is in a holy war against China, the international left, and Islam. I'm not exaggerating in any way. He literally used the terms crusade and holy war to describe what he thinks the United States is doing today. I read through his book. It's nearly 300 pages, and there are so many crazy and extreme things in this book that I'm going to talk about today. But one of the most concerning parts of it that I want to emphasize is that in this book, the current U.S. Defense Secretary called for overthrowing the government of China. Pete Hegseth outlined his vision for what the United States would look like if Donald Trump and the Republicans could remain in power. Again, he wrote this in 2020 on the eve of the 2020 election. And he predicted that the Chinese socialist system would be overthrown, socialism would be defeated. He also said secularism would be defeated because he's a theocrat. And I want to read a passage here from this book that shows what Hegseth wants to happen. This is his vision under Trump in the United States. Quote, "Communist China will fall and lick its wounds for another 200 years, end quote. So he wants to put China back into the century of humiliation, like when it was partially colonized in the 19th and early 20th centuries. He wants to overthrow the government of China, where there are 1.4 billion people, the largest economy in the world when its GDP is measured at purchasing power parity. And he doesn't want China to recover for 200 years. And then he also predicted, quote, "Islamists will never get a nuclear weapon, but will be preemptively bombed back to the 700s when they try," end quote. So not only does he want China to be repressed for 200 years, but he also wants Muslim majority countries, and there are billions of Muslims in the world. He wants them to go back to the 8th century. And then Hegseth wrote in this book, quote, "Israel and America will form an even tighter bond fighting the scourge of Islamism and international leftism that will never fully abate," end quote. Of course, as part of his extreme fundamentalist views and also his warmongering imperialist views, Hegseth considers that the United States and Israel were blessed by God in the Holy War, and he actually has tattoos from the Crusades. He has something that's known as the Crusader cross that's tattooed on his chest. This was the cross, the symbol used by the original Crusaders in the 11th and 12th centuries. And he also has a tattoo in Latin that says Deus vult, which means God wills it. And that was the slogan used by the Crusaders in the 11th and 12th centuries. This guy is an extreme Christian fundamentalist. He is opposed to secularism. He wrote an entire chapter opposing what he called evil secularism. He argued against the separation of church and state. He argued that the United States should base its laws on the Bible. And he called on Christians today in the 21st century to continue the Crusades that were started over 1,100 years ago. By the way, I should point out that the reason that Donald Trump even discovered this guy in the first place is because Hegseth was a host on Fox News. He worked at Fox News for a decade, and Trump regularly watched him on TV and decided, hey, that guy would be great to run the Pentagon, to oversee the U.S. Department of Defense, managing the most powerful and dangerous military on earth. And as U.S. Defense Secretary, Hegseth has been very aggressive. In fact, he regularly appears on Fox News, where he previously worked for years. And in an interview on Fox in March, he said the United States is prepared to go to war with China. And this was in response to the Chinese embassy in the U.S. responding to Donald Trump's threats. You know, Trump has imposed more and more tariffs on China. The average tariff on China is now around 33%, and every month Trump keeps expanding tariffs. And in response to these threats, the Chinese embassy in the U.S. said that we are going to defend our country, and if the U.S. wants to wage a war, a tariff war, or any other kind of war with us, we are going to defend our country. Fox News portrayed this as a so-called threat, but it's actually the Trump administration that is threatening China, and China is responding. So Pete Hegseth was asked about this on Fox News, and he said that we're prepared, if necessary, to go to war.
This was posted by the Chinese embassy. Quote, if war is what the U.S. wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight till the end. As Secretary of Defense, how do you take that?
Well, we're prepared. Those who long for peace must prepare for war. That's why we're rebuilding our military. That's why we're reestablishing deterrence and the warrior ethos, is because we live in a dangerous world with powerful ascendant countries with very different ideologies. You mentioned defense spending. They're rapidly increasing their defense spending. Modern technology. They want to supplant the United States. If we want to deter war with the Chinese or others, we have to be strong. And that president understands peace comes through strength. We need the defense spending, the capabilities, the weapons, and the posture in the Indo-Pacific, which is something we're very much focusing.
There's an entire section of Hegseth's book that is dedicated to fear-mongering about China. He wrote that, quote, our largest geopolitical foe is communist China, end quote. And he quoted President Trump during his first term when Trump said that China is a threat to the world. This is a quote from Trump in the White House back in 2019.
Obviously, China is a threat to the world in a sense because they're building a military faster than anybody.
In his book, Hegseth wrote that, quote, even Mickey Mouse would understand that the communist Chinese government and its economic engine are a threat, and we must compel our companies to stop enabling them with American technology. We must bring the companies back home to America coercively if necessary, end quote. And what's also funny, very ironic, is that he accused China of lying, cheating, and stealing. And he said, quote, you cannot trade fairly with an enemy that lies, cheats, and steals, end quote. I put a little note here when I was reading his book that this is deeply ironic because during Trump's first term, Trump's CIA director and then Secretary of State was the neoconservative war hawk Mike Pompeo. And Pompeo famously admitted in a speech at a U.S. military academy, he said, I was the CIA director and we trained people how to lie, cheat, and steal.
What's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses.
So as the saying goes, every accusation that the U.S. makes about another country is actually a confession for what the U.S. empire itself does, which includes lying, cheating, and steal, and threatening the world and waging war everywhere and overthrowing foreign governments and meddling in foreign affairs of independent sovereign countries. But in this book, the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, he complains that, quote, the Chinese have used their wealth to consolidate communist power, spread their influence around the globe, and ultimately shape our culture, end quote. He fearmongered about China's global infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative, and he claimed that China, quote, wants to control the 21st century, end quote. And then he fearmongered about China's influence in American media outlets and universities. He talked about Walt Disney and Confucius institutes on U.S. college campuses where they teach people how to speak Chinese, but he thinks that's an evil plot. And Pete Hegseth wrote that the Chinese, quote, are literally the villains of our generation, end quote. So he sees the world like a Hollywood movie. It's between good and bad. The US and Israel are the heroes, the good guys, and China and Muslims, according to him, are the villains in this Hollywood movie. And finally, Hegseth concluded this section on China in his book, claiming that China is waging a technological war, cultural war, trade war, and military war. He claimed that China wants the, quote, reestablishment of the former Chinese empire, which is completely false. It's not true. And then he said in his typical hysterical fashion, quote, if we don't stand up to communist China now, we will be standing for the Chinese anthem someday, end quote. So this is the guy running the military, running the Pentagon, and do not expect him to pursue peace with China. He's made it very clear that his goal is overthrowing the Chinese government. And that's why, on Fox News, he's saying that the US is prepared for war with China. This is very dangerous. Now, I'm going to go through some of the other passages from his book, American Crusade, and you can see some of his other very extreme views. But before that, I want to talk about what Hegseth has been like as the US Defense Secretary. His rhetoric has been very aggressive. In fact, just a few days after the Trump administration came to power in January, Hegseth delivered a message to the US Armed Forces, and he pledged, quote, we will remain the strongest and most lethal force in the world. This has basically become Hegseth's personal catchphrase. He constantly repeats that he's going to make the US military the most lethal in the world. This is a message that he sent to the American people in February.
In making our military once again the most lethal, badass fighting force on the planet.
Now, Hegseth has been very controversial, and there's been a lot of media coverage of him, not because of his insane far-right Christian fascist book, American Crusade, where he says that the U.S. is in a holy war. I mean, that book is so extreme. We'll get to that in a second. But a lot of the media has been more focused on his crusade against DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is all part of the culture war in U.S. politics, which is always trying to distract from the imperialist war that the U.S. is waging against the rest of the world, against China and the global South. And of course, one of the things that the media has been focused on is that Hegseth has been very aggressive in firing women. He's just very cruel. He's firing women officers in the military. He's firing black officers in the military. He's going out of his way basically to say that the US military is for white men. And his whole rhetoric is that we need to be against wokeism and DEI. And he says we need to be a meritocracy. Everything should be about merit. And he's been saying the same message for years. Back when he was on Fox News, he said that the goal of the U.S. military should be based on meritocracy and lethality.
We should only be focused on readiness and meritocracy and lethality.
But what's funny is that while Hegseth is constantly criticizing wokeism and DEI, he himself uses his own kind of conservative version of woke rhetoric. He insists that we should not call U.S. soldiers troops or soldiers. We should call them warfighters.
Ever since I've taken this position, the only thing I care about is doing right by the warfighters, by the troops. In short, we want the biggest, most badass military on the planet, on God's green earth.
And what's also deeply ironic is seeing how this conservative culture war rhetoric is now being used by the defense secretary who's overseeing the U.S. military. In the address that he gave to the American people, he constantly criticized the media, which is so funny because he is from the media.
Now, the legacy media has, of course, a different agenda. You see the same clickbait headlines that I do. Time after time, the media distorts good news stories or often just gets them flat wrong. In many cases, well, in most cases, they have an agenda.
His job was, he was a host on Fox News. The reason that Donald Trump discovered this guy is because he was on Fox News every day.
Senator Roger Wicker says, I want a major move to expand the military-industrial complex. It's just not big enough right now. Even if we were going to on a war footing, do you support something like that?
Well, it needs to be focused on you need a military-industrial complex. There's no doubt about it. You need it focused on the future, not building the stuff of the past. So we've got to change the way it operates.
Now, the other big story is we have managed to do some research, and it is Pete Hegseth's birthday around today.
Goodness.
And of course, as the U.S. Defense Secretary, Hegseth has been collaborating very closely with Israel. Again, in his book, American Crusade, he said that God has ordained the United States and Israel to wage a holy war against China, the left, and Islam. Well, immediately after becoming Defense Secretary, Hegseth met with his counterpart from Israel, and he met with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is wanted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. And the Pentagon published a readout that said that Secretary Hegseth, quote, emphasized the unbreakable bond that exists between the United States and Israel. Now, those words were just mild compared to the rhetoric that Hegseth used in his book, American Crusade. He said, quote, if you don't understand why Israel matters and why it is so central to the story of Western civilization, with America being its greatest manifestation, then you don't live in history. America's story is inextricably linked to Judeo-Christian history and the modern state of Israel, end quote. Of course, throughout this book, he argues against secularism. He says the United States is a Christian country and its laws should be based on the Bible. And of course, he sees Israel as the same. And what's funny is in this book, he says, if you want to learn about Israel, you should go check out PragerU on YouTube. I mean, this guy's intellectual capacities are quite low. Now, Elon Musk, the world's richest billionaire oligarch, likes to use this term, the woke mind virus. But in reality, if you read this book, American Crusade, you can see that Pete Hegseth has the culture war mind virus. He spends so many paragraphs ranting about college students. This is a grown man in his 40s, and yet he's constantly ranting about teenagers on college campuses. And he wrote, quote, Israel is enemy number one for both Islamists and international leftists, which is reason alone to love it, end quote. And then he talks about America's college campuses are full of groups pushing the BDS agenda. In this book, Hegseth told his readers that it's time to, quote, put a full-on American crusade into action, end quote. And he said, quote, for us as American crusaders, Israel embodies the soul of our American crusade, the why to our what, faith, family, freedom, and free enterprise. If you love those, learn to love the state of Israel, end quote. Now, of course, it's not surprising to see U.S. officials praise Israel. This is what all major U.S. government officials do, because, as Netanyahu himself said, Israel is a mighty aircraft carrier of the U.S. empire, or former U.S. Secretary of State Alexander Haig said that Israel is an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the U.S. empire. So this isn't new. But what is especially concerning about Hegseth is that during Trump's first term as president, Hegseth, back when he was a host on Fox News, he went on TV and he called on Trump to wage war against Iran. He said that Trump should bomb Iranian cultural sites, civilian areas in Iran, and rewrite the rules of war to be advantageous to the United States.
None of this, though, changes the calculation of this regime, which is an evil regime. They need to come back limping and begging. I happen to believe that we can't kick the can down the road any longer in trying to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb. So what better time than now to say, we're starting the clock. You've got a week. You've got X amount of time before we start taking out your energy production facilities. We take out key infrastructure. We take out your missile sites. We take out nuclear developments. We take out port capabilities. Or, you know, take out a Quds headquarters while you're at it if you want.
But what do you know about these cultural sites? Because we're not supposed to be hitting cultural sites. But I understand, I've been hearing that we believe that the Iranians are hiding missiles and weapons in some of these cultural sites, churches,
of course they do.
Mosques.
This is what Islamists do. It's what they've done on the battlefield against folks like me and my entire generation. Human shields, using mosques, using hospitals, schools. This is what our enemies do. If we're going to fight to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb, this regime, then we need to rewrite the rules that are advantageous to us.
This is very, very troubling because in the Israeli regime, there are a lot of far-right extremists, fanatics, who are chomping at the bit to wage war against Iran. And with people like Pete Hegseth overseeing the Pentagon and other war hawks and neocons in the Trump administration, like the neoconservative Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and the neocon National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, there's a very real possibility that Israel could start a war against Iran with U.S. support, of course. The Trump administration would back them. And they've already been waging war against Gaza, ethnically cleansing Gaza. Trump said he wants to take over and colonize Gaza.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it.
Israel's been waging war against Lebanon, been waging war against Syria. The U.S. has also been helping Israel to bomb Syria. They've bombed Iraq. Iran is their ultimate target. And with people like Hegseth in charge, Israel is absolutely going to get a green light. So for more context, who is this guy, Pete Hegseth? I mean, I already talked about how he was a host on Fox News, which is how Trump discovered him. That was his main job qualification for Trump. But Pete Hegseth has been politically involved in the Republican Party for many years, and he has tried to rebrand himself as a so-called populist, which is very cynical because this guy comes from a very elite background. He studied at Princeton University, and then he did a master's at Harvard's Kennedy School, which is the elite bastion of the political class. It's trained a who's who of global elites.
Look at this. Harvard University.
Oh, dear.
Now, if you look at the shields, the shields on the diploma.
Is your mom going to be mad?
Very mad. I don't think my wife's going to like this either. And then I think we finish it off by saying, return to sender. Right here, and then I'll just sign it for good, for good.
You know what I say, Pete? One down, one to go. Andrew, will you grab that Princeton diploma?
Oh, no, not yet.
If we're going to do it, we're going to go all the way.
People will say, this is just a stunt. You still have a degree, and that's fine. I went. I got the degree. I walked the classes, all of that. But I hope this is a statement.
And after Hegseth graduated from Princeton, what was his job? He worked on Wall Street. He was a stock market analyst for Bear Stearns, which was the investment bank and financial services company that collapsed in the 2008 financial crisis. So this guy is not a representative of the humble American working class. I mean, again, his elite resume includes Princeton, Harvard, and Wall Street. And then when he first got involved in politics, he was an extreme neocon. I mean, he was just a card-carrying, cookie-cutter neocon. In fact, Hegseth ran for the U.S. Senate in 2012, and he was supported by some of the most notorious neoconservative warmongers like Bill Kristol. I mean, one of the original neocons who strongly supported the illegal U.S. invasion of Iraq. And in fact, Hegseth was such a strong supporter of Bush in the Iraq War that he volunteered to get sent to Iraq as a soldier in the U.S. Army, and he fought in the Iraq War. And after he joined the U.S. Army, Hegseth was sent for a year to Guantanamo Bay, the U.S. internment camp where people were tortured. I mean, some of the most brutal forms of torture you can imagine. This is very well documented. People were being tortured under the Bush administration while Hegseth was serving there with the U.S. military in Guantanamo while he was there. And Hegseth has been totally supportive of the U.S. military's policy in Guantanamo. In fact, in February of 2025, he visited the U.S. internment camp in Guantanamo Bay and did a photo op posing with U.S. soldiers. This is illegally occupied Cuban territory, by the way. The Cuban government has said for decades that the U.S. government has to give this territory back to Cuba, but the U.S. continues to occupy it, and the Trump administration is even deporting undocumented immigrants to this internment camp in Guantanamo just to prove how cruel and vicious he is. And finally, this brings me back to the book American Crusade, published by the current U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth back in 2020 when he was working as a Fox News host. I already looked at some of the extreme passages in here. I want to look at a few more. Now, this book is nearly 300 pages long, and over half of it is dedicated to fighting against what he calls leftism. That's one of his main enemies, along with China and Islam. And he's in his book, he has chapters dedicated to leftism, globalism, genderism, socialism, secularism, environmentalism, elitism, which is hilarious because he doesn't mention that he went to Princeton and Harvard and worked on Wall Street for an investment bank as a stock analyst. But anyway, and then he has chapters on multiculturalism and Islamism. And his final chapter is titled, Make the Crusade Great Again. On the first page of this book, Hegseth declares a holy war. That is the language he used. He said, quote, "This time in our history calls for an American crusade. Yes, a holy war for the righteous cause of human freedom," end quote. And he mentions the crusader slogan, Deus vult, which is in Latin, it means God wills it. And he notes that this was the rallying cry of the Christian knights during the original Crusades 1,000 years ago as they marched to Jerusalem. So this is why he has the tattoo, Deus vult, on his arm, because he's saying, I'm a crusader. I'm continuing the crusade that was started 1,100 years ago. And for Pete Hegseth, this crusade is not only against Islam. I mean, it is against Islam, but more fundamentally, it's against the political left and against China. And in this book, in the first page, he basically says that there's going to be a civil war. He said, quote, "The other side, the left, is not our friend. We are not esteemed colleagues, nor mere political opponents. We are foes. Either we win or they win. We agree on nothing else," end quote. And then later he said, quote, "Our future existence as sons and daughters of freedom requires the satisfaction of a single paramount objective, the categorical defeat of the left. America cannot and will not survive otherwise," end quote. I mean, this guy really is a Christian fascist. He is a representative of the US version of the Taliban. On the second page of this book, Hegseth declares that the United States is the greatest country ever made in human history, and he says you can never say anything bad about the United States. He denies all of the horrific crimes committed by the United States, and he said, quote, "We should never, ever apologize for her. If you don't agree with that statement, at best, you are utterly ignorant of human history. At worst, you are a willing enemy of freedom and America," end quote. I mean, this is just fascism. He's saying, if you don't support the United States 100%, if you criticize the United States, you are an enemy and we are at war with you. This is the way he sees the world. And not only other countries. I mean, if you're a Muslim, if you're Chinese, he sees you as a major enemy. But also, if you are an American on the left, a left-wing person, he also sees you as the enemy. He wrote, quote, "Donald Trump's Red Hat Rebellion demonstrates that unapologetically going on offense is the only tenable strategy for the defense of our republic. Surrounded by the left, with the odds stacked against us, only a crusade will do," end quote. Now, in this book, Hegseth repeatedly talks about an impending civil war in the United States. He really says that there's going to be a civil war between the right and the left. And he predicted that it would happen after the 2020 election if Trump lost. Now, newsflash, Donald Trump did lose the 2020 election. Joe Biden, the Democrat, won. But in this book, which was published before the 2020 election, Hegseth predicted that if the Democrats won, then globalism and genderism and socialism and secularism would win. He said leftism will enslave us as with all big government until it's enslaved by Islamism. And then he said communist China will rise and rule the globe. He continued saying Islamists will get nuclear weapons and seek to wipe America and Israel off the map. And then he said, I'm quoting, "Yes, there will be some form of civil war. It's a horrific scenario that nobody wants, but would be difficult to avoid." Now, obviously that didn't happen, but that's what he fantasizes about. Now, also in this book, Hegseth wrote that, quote, we need to mock, humiliate, intimidate, and crush our leftist opponents, end quote. This is the guy who's now running the US military. And then he said that in order to be a true American, you have to support free markets and you have to support a large, strong military. And he said, quote, leftists have surrounded traditional American patriots on all sides, ready to close in for the kill, killing our founders, killing our flag, killing capitalism. The only option for survival in a near ambush is to charge, to close with and destroy the enemy. He said, now, while President Trump gives us cover fire, is our moment to reload, fix bayonets, and charge toward the enemy. Attack. And then he adds, oh, did I trigger you, bedwetters? But I mean, he spends so much of this book talking about a civil war. And then he's like, well, I'm not calling for violence, but he's saying there is going to be a civil war against the left and we're going to crush them. But I'm not calling for violence. It's part of the same old tactic that far-right extremists always use, where they say, well, of course I'm not calling for violence, right after they call for violence. Now, I want to also briefly look at another chapter in this book, which is dedicated to fighting secularism. And what's funny is he begins this chapter praising Kanye West, and Hegseth portrayed Kanye West as a hero, a great symbol of a good Christian in the United States. Now, he published this book in 2020, so right after he published this book, Kanye West came out as a huge fan of Hitler. He's repeatedly defended Adolf Hitler. So this is the great hero that Pete Hegseth says is a model for American Christians, is the Hitler admirer Kanye West. But in this chapter, Hegseth makes it clear that he wants the United States to be a theocracy. He thinks that the US is a Christian country. Its laws should be based on the Bible. He wrote, quote, we must fight back against the evil forces of secularism, end quote. He said, quote, our founders would be disgusted with the secularist America of today, end quote, which is actually deeply ironic. It's also just historically false because, yes, there were some founding fathers in the United States who were religious, but there were also people like Thomas Jefferson who were not atheists, but they were deists. They did not believe in a God, a personalized God who actually responds to prayers. They believed deeply in humanity. They were humanists. So, I mean, there's even something called the Jeffersonian Bible, where he took all of the religious parts out of the Bible and treated the Bible as a kind of secular text, teaching people good morality. So this is just a completely false representation of U.S. history. But of course, Hegseth argues that President Trump is a symbol of theocracy who's fighting against secularism, which is also so funny because everyone knows that Trump is not religious. I mean, he says he's a Christian, but then, he's been asked in interviews, like, what's your favorite part of the Bible? And Trump says, all of it's my favorite. I mean, because everyone knows Trump doesn't read the Bible.
You mentioned the Bible. You've been talking about how it's your favorite book. And you said, I think last night in Iowa, some people are surprised that you say that. I'm wondering what one or two of your most favorite Bible verses are and why.
I wouldn't want to get into it because to me that's very personal. When I talk about the Bible, it's very personal. So I don't want to get into verses. I don't want to get into.
There's no verse that means a lot to you that you think about or cite.
The Bible means a lot to me, but I don't want to get into specifics.
Even to cite a verse that
you
like?
No, I don't want to do that.
You're an Old Testament guy or a New Testament guy?
Probably equal. I think it's just an incredible. The whole Bible is an incredible.
So it's so funny seeing these extreme fundamentalists like Hegseth portraying Trump as someone who's, quote, stemming the tide of secularism. He unabashedly supports faith and fights back against the secular currents long at work in American society. He has inspired crusaders, is what Hegseth wrote. I mean, this guy is crazy. And I want to look at one other chapter in this book in which Pete Hegseth fearmongers about Islam. Now, there are nearly 2 billion Muslims on earth. About 1/4 of the world population is Muslim. And yet in this chapter, he makes it clear that he not only sees Islamists, but Muslims as a threat. And what is the difference for people who don't know? So Islam is a religion, obviously. A Muslim is someone who practices the religion, like a Christian practices Christianity. Islamism is a political movement that argues that Islam should be the basis for the political system, right? So a Christian theocrat like Pete Hegseth believes that Christianity should be the basis for the political system. He's against secularism. There are a lot of Muslims who also believe in a secular political system. There are a lot of Muslims in the United States who are U.S. citizens, and they're fine with the secular U.S. political system. But Hegseth says no. He argues that all Muslims are actually Islamists, and he argues that even if Muslims seem like good people, they still are trying to take over the world. I mean, this is his insane Islamophobic worldview. He says, quote, regular Muslims like him, he's talking about a friend, regular Muslims believe that Islam's destiny is to control the world, end quote. Later on, he argues that there is really no distinction between being a Muslim and an Islamist. Even if someone says that they're a Muslim and not an Islamist, he argues that there's no difference. And he says that Islamism is the most dangerous ism in the world, and it only seeks war, that you cannot have peaceful coexistence. He even puts the word moderate in scare quotes and peaceful in scare quotes when he talks about moderate mosques and peaceful Muslims, making it clear that he does not think it's possible for a Muslim to be moderate and peaceful. And then he wrote in this chapter, quote, next to the communist Chinese and their global ambitions, Islamism is the most dangerous threat to freedom in the world. It cannot be negotiated with, coexisted with, or understood. It must be exposed, marginalized, and crushed. Just like the Christian crusaders who pushed back against the Muslim hordes in the 12th century, American crusaders will need to muster the same courage against Islamists today, end quote. This is insane. So in this chapter, this guy who is now the leader of the Pentagon, the defense secretary, overseeing the U.S. military, he's arguing that there's no such thing as moderate Muslims and peaceful Muslims, that all Muslims are actually Islamists. There are 2 billion, nearly 2 billion Muslims in the world, 1/4 of the world population. He's saying that you cannot exist with these people, that the U.S. needs to be on a crusade and a holy war against 2 billion people. This is so crazy. And especially with Israel at war with Palestine, at war with Lebanon, at war with Syria, at war with Iraq, and threatening war on Iran, and with this guy leading the Pentagon, this is very, very troubling. Now, the last thing that I'm going to mention today is a hilarious section in this book in which Pete Hegseth acknowledges that his views are so extreme. I mean, this guy is a fundamentalist Christian fascist. His views are so extreme that, as he wrote, quote, in this cause, I've lost friends, many. Some members of my extended family have no interest in speaking with me, and the feeling is mutual. People I used to admire send me nasty letters and emails telling me what a terrible person I am, end quote. So this is the guy leading the U.S. military, a man who is so extreme, his views are so fanatical that he admits in his book that he's lost many friends and family members refuse to talk to him because he's such a weirdo who's obsessed with the culture war, and he calls himself a crusader, and he has crusade tattoos, multiple crusader tattoos, and he says that we need to wage a holy war against China, the left, and Islam. This is the guy Donald Trump chose to be the U.S. Defense Secretary. We are in a very dangerous moment. And if there's a war with Iran or even a war with China, unfortunately, it would not surprise me, especially with these fanatics, not only like Pete Hegseth, but also the neoconservative warmonger Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, or the other neocon, Mike Waltz, as National Security Advisor. You know, Trump and his supporters have portrayed themselves as populists, and they've sometimes cynically claimed that they're resisting the neocons, but in reality, Trump has chosen mouth-foaming neocons to run his foreign policy. And if you want to get more information about what's actually happening in U.S. foreign policy, please like and subscribe. Please follow our work here at Geopolitical Economy Report. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you soon. Thanks a lot.